I was the producer of the show, and I wouldn't have had the time to do what I needed to do if I'd been the actor on the show, because as the producer, head writer of the show, I wrote 40 of the first 60 shows myself without any story editor. Sheldon was the executive producer, and he did, help me when after the first 13 shows, I would talk to him about what I was coming up with, and he would be very helpful. But we had outside writers writing, out of 60, 20 shows, for the first 2 years. But those shows were harder for me. I was my own script supervisor, my own story editor. So the rewrites took me 8 days. Writing a show took me 4, so that's why I wrote so many. So the first 2 or 3 years were murder for me. I was working 7 days a week. Today, you see a bunch of lists. I get very upset. I said, why are there 15 names? Executive, co-executive producer, near to the, standing next to the executive producer, friend of the executive producer, relative of the executive producer, producer. You see 15 names. And I say, somebody's not doing a lot of work. Somebody's doing all the work, and somebody's not doing a lot of work. Because I knew what it was to do. In those days, the producer was usually a writer. The producer of any show, Aaron Rubin on the Andy Griffith Show, and every show, Gary Marshall on all the shows he was on, the hands-on producer-writer. If I didn't have the help, especially in the third year, where Persky and Denoff came on, and they had written a couple of shows. They had written the first show of the season for me that year. They had done a spec script for me a year before. My manager, George Shapiro, said, these guys are very funny. They were on radio in New York. They're very funny. They love the show. And they wrote a script that was way off. And I said, no, it's not a battle of the sexes. They didn't get the idea of the show. And I didn't take them. And 2 years later, a year and a half later, George comes back. He says, they have an idea for a show. They'd love to pitch it to you. I said, I can't turn them down again. That was a spec thing. I shouldn't have even read it. They came in with the birth of the baby, the Wrong Baby show, which was brilliant and hilarious. And then I asked them to write a multiple deal with them, and they said, can we have offices here so we can learn and watch? And so they became like my buddies. And the fourth year, they became story editors, so I could have my Saturdays off. I had a lot of good help. There was a fellow named David Adler who in the first year wrote four very good shows for me. Gary Marshall came in like on the second or third year, I can't remember. And Gary Marshall and Jerry Belson were a wonderful team. And I loved having meetings with these guys because we'd have story meetings with Persky and Denoff and Belson and Marshall and Sheldon and myself and come up with, what we call springboards. And then they would send in a one-page outline, 3 scenes, and then we'd go home and do it. And when those guys wrote it, I didn't have to work hard. I didn't have to work as hard. And you always have to work a little because nobody's reality, and everybody's reality is a little different. And I knew my characters. I knew they could say certain things and wouldn't say. So there were little pencil marks, but less pencil marks on their shows than Persky and Denoff and Belson and Marshall. And then there were a couple other good writers who wrote wonderful shows for me, Baer and Jolson and Freeman and Cohen. There were a couple of wonderful writers, and Idelson and Bobrick, I think. I can't remember. But it was Belson and Marshall and Bill Persky and Sam Denoff who really saved my life.